Hello everyone, I'm Professor David Hosken, Pro Vice-Chancellor for the University of Exeter's Cornwall campuses, and I'm a biologist by trade. This month is COP26, the 26th conference of the parties, the 26th meeting of all the states that have signed on to the United Nations framework on the Convention of Climate Change. And this event is more important than ever before. I and my fellow environmental scientists are watching closely to see what action is taken and what commitments are made this November. It is clear to all of us that we need to make changes and make them now. We are already in a biodiversity crisis and we must turn this around. At Exeter, over the next couple of weeks, we're running a series of events with academics from across the university, some of our alumni and our industry partners. We'll be assessing how to achieve net zero, the role of the finance industry in this, and how we can mitigate against the effects of warming. These are three themes around the COP26 goals, and time is short. But first, I want to share with you thoughts from around our community on why COP26 is so crucial and what gives us hope for the future. The solutions are out there. We just need to implement them, and we need to implement them now.
I'm Angela Gallego-Sala. I'm a professor at geography at the University of Exeter. I work on understanding the response of peatlands to climate change. What gives me hope, I think, is the seemingly endless capacity of nature to regenerate, and also the creativity capacity of human beings that through art can challenge the way we look at the world and the way we understand our societies. I also find hope in young people that fight to improve our world and to ensure that we have a more fair and more just world. Finally, somebody that has shown courage in my field. I think I'm daily struck by courage of colleagues and people that are working near me. Everybody has had to deal with very challenging situations during the pandemic, but especially colleagues that work knowing or being very aware of the environmental and climate crisis that we're living in, and still continue to fight to find solutions.
I'm now here with Professor Peter Cox, Professor of Climate Systems Dynamics in Mathematics at the University of Exeter. Now, Peter's a lead author on the last 3 assessment reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and a highly cited author in Geosciences. He was also recently named one of the most influential climate scientists in the world by Reuters. So welcome, Peter. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Emma. Yeah, it's good to be here.
Now, could you just tell us a little bit more about your research?
Yeah, so I cut my teeth on climate modelling. I used to work for the Met Office in the climate modelling science side of it. And my specialism is in the interaction between climate change and the carbon cycle, and especially how vegetation and soils are affected by climate change, and therefore how much of our carbon they will continue to take up into the future. So that's my specialism, but I'm just very interested in my title, Climate Dynamics, is basically a fancy name for climate change. I'm interested in climate change and what causes it and whether we can understand it better, and obviously also what we can do about it.
Brilliant. And what can climate modelling tell us about the future?
Well, we've got a pretty clear picture now that if we continue to release CO2, mainly from fossil fuel burning, then the climate will continue to warm. And something that's sort of an emergent simplicity has occurred in the recent past, which is that it's become pretty clear there's almost a linear relationship, a proportionality between the total amount of emissions we emit from the pre-industrial, so we've already done a lot of that, and so on, and global warming. So even though the system is very complicated and people like me can spend our entire careers enjoying the complexity, the bottom line as far as anthropogenic climate change is concerned is really simple, which is basically, to a very good approximation, there's a relationship between global warming and the total amount of emissions we've emitted since pre-industrial. It's a straight line. So we sort of know the more we emit, the further we go up this line, and the larger the impacts are.
Great. And now obviously it's COP26 this November. What would you like to see achieved at the summit?
Yeah, well, I think most climate scientists would say it's good that we're talking about it, but we've been talking, this is 26, it's the 26th Conference of the Parties. And if you look at the CO2 record, it's just kept on going up. So in the UK, we've done quite well on certain parts of our emissions and we've turned them around. But on the whole, the global emissions are going up and up and up, and global warming is going up and up and up for the reasons I said. So the voluntary commitments or the intended contributions that nations are putting forward for COP26 would get us to what's called SSP 245. This is a lovely title, isn't it? But basically it's global warming of somewhere around 2.5, probably 3 degrees by the end of the century. So that's what's being promised. They are involved with trying to meet the Paris commitments, which are basically 2, ideally 1.5 and no more than 2. So we are nowhere near that, even if you believe that nations do exactly what they've said they would do, and they're not, I don't think they're legally binding as yet. So basically the 2 things we need is greater ambition on emission cuts and for them to be legally binding. And I think they're the 2 main things. Then there are issues to do with equity, the fact that basically climate change is caused by the developed world, but the impacts will be felt largely by the developing world that haven't really emitted very much yet at all. So there's a whole issue about the sort of adaptation fund, which you would want for fairness, but the bottom line is that we're not anywhere near what we're supposed to be doing as a global community to get climate change under control. So we just need more, and we need it to be taken more seriously and for it not to always go down the agenda, basically.
Yeah, definitely. Now, COP makes the news quite a lot. It has done in the run up to the event. Why is it such an important event?
Well, it is the time when there's a chance for nations to actually get to grips, to agree on things and get to grips collectively with emissions. And that has been happening. I mean, the so-called carbon intensity of economies, which is basically how much carbon you emit per unit of economic growth, has been going down, but not as fast as economic growth has taken it up. So even though we worry about economic growth, bottom line is it's pretty much always faster than decarbonisation. And that's a big issue. So basically we can get, if we look at certain metrics, we can convince ourselves we're getting this under control. The emissions per unit GDP is going down, but actually the overall emissions in an absolute sense are going up. So when we get to the COP, it's a chance to say, what more can we do? And there is a lot to be said for, well, it's got to be collective action. So the thing about carbon dioxide, unlike other pollutants, is it's very well mixed in the atmosphere. So when we emit something here, it goes all the way around the globe and affects the climate for everyone. And that's not normally the case with pollution. You know, you generally think about pollutants as affecting your backyard. If I have a bonfire here, it doesn't just affect my neighbours, it affects me, but it doesn't affect anyone miles away. Yeah. In some ways that's useful because the negative impacts come back to us, and that means we tend to modify our behaviour. But it's not like that with CO2, so you have to do it together, basically. So there is an opportunity. So when the COPs get together, when the Conference of Parties happen, it's a chance for nations to basically say, let's do something more or something different or commit to more and get this done. So they are always important, and every one of these 26 we've held with great hopes. And some of them have delivered a lot. So Paris in 2015 was the last one where we thought, well, that's a major advance. There was one before in Copenhagen in 2009. A lot of them don't deliver much. They're kind of bureaucratic in a way because you've got to get details sorted out. But this one, because it is an attempt to get binding commitments on Paris targets, and it's UK-led, of course. And the UK has always felt that it takes the high ground on climate change. There's a lot more focus on it than before, I think. And so this one, COP26, might turn out to be a really important one. Might just turn out to be a huge jamboree. We hope it's the first one.
Well, let's hope not. Which leads me on to my final question, which is, as a climate scientist, you know, what gives you hope for the future?
The main thing is that I think there's an engagement, a broader engagement in the issue than before. So we'd see things from Extinction Rebellion and Insulate Britain, and Greta Thunberg is unbelievably influential, much more than climate scientists who've been working in the field like me for decades and decades will ever be. So there is some real grassroots movement now to get something done, and that's great. I think it needs to be reacted to and kind of made real by policymakers. So you need this bottom-up thing going on that drives policymakers and basically says to politicians, we're not going to vote you out if you do something about this, the opposite, in fact. So I'd like to see that continue, which is a real hope. And then I think we need to get to an election in any country where climate change is near the top rather than the bottom. And even if it starts at the top in an election campaign, there's no one talking about it by the end. They're talking about economic growth, which in a sense is counter to climate change, but it's never really exposed. So I think we have to get to the point where people really do shout out and say they want something done. We vote on the basis of that. And that collectively, we also buy on the basis of that, because the things that individuals can do are to basically vote for governments that can act on climate change and to buy things that are less damaging to the environment. And the second one requires we have better information. I'm not sure if the COP will deal with that, but it ought to start to deal with that, which is if you give citizens information, they will make decisions, and often they'll make decisions in the right direction. People are not intrinsically bad, in my view. It's just that we often don't have the information or the choices that allow us to make the right decision.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for your time, Peter. Really appreciate you talking to us today.
Nice to speak to you.
I'm here with Dr. Freya Garry, a scientist in the UK Climate Resilience team at the Met Office. Freya studies projections of future UK climate change to understand how it will affect UK sectors such as agriculture, and contributes to a UK-wide project called the Strategic Priority Fund for Climate Resilience. Freya is also a co-founder of the Women in Climate Network, a joint network between the University of Exeter and the Met Office. Hi, Freya. And can I ask to start with, if you could just tell us a bit more about your work?
So in the climate resilience team at the Met Office, we look at the impacts that climate change could have on various UK sectors now and in the future. Decision makers can then use this understanding of climate risk that they face to help them make decisions about climate adaptation. My work also focuses on a special type of weather and climate hazard called compound events, which is when two or more hazards happen at the same time or close together. These compound events can have bigger impacts than when the events occur separately.
Okay, and what inspired you to become a climate scientist?
So I was inspired to become a climate scientist from quite a young age, because I've really been always interested in science and nature and the relationship between humans and the planet. And when I was at school, I learned about how using more renewable energy could help reduce human-induced climate change. And growing up near the sea, I was fascinated by the oceans and the really important role that oceans play in the climate system. So I went to study them at university. And after my PhD at the University of Southampton and National Oceanography Centre, I continued researching the ocean's role in the climate system at the University of Exeter for a postdoc before I moved to the Met Office, which is a world leader in climate science and services.
Okay, and obviously the subjects you've mentioned are kind of covered in various aspects of what will be discussed at COP26, but I guess overall, and particularly from the perspective of your research, what do you want to see achieved at COP26?
So the 26th COP, or the Conference of Parties, is part of the main decision-making body of the UN Framework Convention of Climate Change, which is an agreement between 197 countries of the United Nations to stabilise greenhouse gas concentrations at a level that would prevent dangerous human-induced interference with the climate system. So my personal hope is very closely tied to that, is that COP26 achieves decision-making that will help the world succeed in this goal of preventing dangerous human-induced climate change for the majority of humanity as soon as possible. Sadly, extreme events attributable to climate change are already taking lives.
And what are the key decisions that could be taken from your perspective? What are the key sort of priorities? I know you can't speak for everything that will be discussed at COP, but the key priorities from the perspective of your research.
So the themes of COP actually do align very well with our research, and there's a lot of around working together, for example. So in the work that we do here at the Met Office, we're trying to not just provide climate information for other people to use, but also to work with different sectors to help them use the information and present it in a way that is useful and usable to them. So that principle of working together is really core to what we do here.
Okay, and why is COP26, given that it's the 26th, why is this now such an important event?
So COP26 is a really important event because climate change is happening now and it's already having impacts on many people around the world. And globally, it is understood that we need rapid reduction in fossil fuel emissions to minimise the impacts of climate change. Some future warming is inevitable, but the size of future emissions and how we adapt to climate change will determine how large the impacts that we see in future are. And climate change is one of the most serious threats facing our world. It's not just a threat to the environment, but also a threat to national and global security, poverty eradication, and economic prosperity. COP26 is a really key opportunity for nations from around the world to come together and make decisions together about how they will respond to climate change.
And just the final question is, what gives you hope for the future?
I have hope for the future because humans do have a tremendous capacity to innovate and implement changes to society when they choose. So COVID-19, for example, has given us an insight into the role that government and society can play in driving extensive, rapid changes in lifestyle and social norms. We've made lots of positive changes, for example, going forward in some workplaces, so the ability to work from home more and better technology for virtual working, not needing to travel extensively. And this may also make meetings more inclusive for people who don't traditionally have the capacity to travel. Society can also take this opportunity of adapting to climate change to make a better environment. So, for example, in urban areas, lots of trees and water could help cool the cities and prevent overheating in future, as well as providing great leisure spaces locally for people to enjoy.
Hello, I'm Tian, a lecturer in low-carbon engineering. My research focuses on hydrogen energy, in particular hydrogen storage and transportation. Hydrogen is a clean fuel. Water is the only byproduct when using hydrogen. However, hydrogen is lightweighted, is really difficult to pack in a high density, it's invisible and flammable gas. So how to store and transport hydrogen efficiently and safely remain as a technical barrier. So my research is to use smart composite materials to solve this problem. In my mind, in my generation, the biggest and scariest problem is energy. So the fact is we don't have enough energy go around. Fossil fuels that we rely on generate a lot of the environmental problems and climate change, and they are unevenly distributed, which cause wars and conflicts. So I hope in the future and everybody has free access to clean energy.
Hi, I'm joined by Ruth Chapman, who's a PhD researcher at the University of Exeter, focusing on climate modelling. And Ruth is also a member of the organising committee of the Joint Met Office and University's Women in Climate Society, which aims to promote diversity and support the retention of women in climate science. So welcome, Ruth. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, good morning.
Now, first of all, could you tell us a little bit more about your work?
Yeah, so I'm working with a model of something called the AMOC, which is to do with the Atlantic circulation. It's got like a conveyor belt where it transfers heat around the oceans. And this is a system which has something called tipping points. So it's got two different stable states. It's got an on state, which is what it's in at the moment, so we get warm water coming up to Western Europe, but it's also got an off state, which could potentially have been responsible for triggering the last ice age. And so I'm looking with this model at whether we could potentially cause a tipping point with human climate change, which obviously we don't want to do, and maybe different ways that we can avoid that.
Brilliant. Now, what inspired you to become a scientist in the first place?
So I'm actually really lucky. Both my parents are scientists. So I grew up in a very scientific household, doing science experiments in the kitchen and the garden and all these sorts of things. So I always had that sort of curiosity about the world around us. And then I also, you know, it was what I was good at school. And so you're sort of funneled into it a little bit. But I think just that innate curiosity gets you a long way of always questioning what's going on.
Awesome. And what would you say to other young people who are thinking about a career in science?
Science is great. What can I say? If you have questions about the world, this is, you know, the way to answer them. And then also, if you're choosing science at sort of post-16 higher education level, just because you've got A levels or a degree in science doesn't mean you have to stay in science. You know, there's a lot of people that go into other fields. It's a really great starting point for so many different careers. And all my friends from university are doing such different things, but all of them doing really important jobs that are, you know, contributing to society.
Perfect. And now it's COP26 this month. What would you like to see achieved at the summit?
Very big question. I think I could talk for days about this. I think for me, one of the most important things is, you know, the UK government was the first in the world to declare a climate emergency back in 2019, and it feels like very little has changed since then. You know, we saw the reports in the news it was this week about the climate mitigation and what they want to do with fossil fuels in this country, and it just doesn't go far enough. We need to eliminate fossil fuels. The government know they need to do it, but they're not putting the policies in place to actually support what they say they're going to do. So I want them to act like it's an emergency. You know, if your house is on fire, you don't put the TV on, you run out the door and you act like it's an emergency. And I think it's about time our government start acting like that.
Definitely. And then just a final question, what gives you hope for the future?
I think this COP is actually really exciting. Since the last COP in Paris in 2015, there has been so much activism. We've seen so many people take up this issue of climate crisis in Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for Future, the Sunrise Movement in the States. There's a lot more awareness and there's a lot more people calling for change. And I think those people calling for change is what is going to get the governments to act. And so I think this is both a hopeful moment, but also, you know, there's a lot of expectation on COP this month to see what's going to happen.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us, Ruth. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Nice.
I'm joined by Amy Bray, a Biosciences student here at Exeter who founded the environmental charity Another Way in 2019. Amy is an environmental campaigner who recently won a Points of Light award from the Prime Minister. Now, these awards highlight climate leaders and volunteers who are going above and beyond to inspire others to become greener in the run-up to COP26. So welcome, Amy. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Now, could you tell us a little bit more about your charity, Another Way?
Yeah, so in 2019, when I was 16 years old, I founded Another Way. And our aim is to empower individuals to change their behaviour to live more sustainably, because we believe that we've waited too long for someone else to change for us. And we believe that it's everyone's responsibility to do everything we can to live with harmony towards nature and towards our planet. So that's what we aim to do through awareness and education sessions, through online resources, through events bringing our community together. We've also got 2 zero waste shops in Penrith and Kendal in Cumbria, so they help people to actually change the way they live by enabling them to reduce the amount of waste they produce. And all the profits go into the charity, so it closes this loop of awareness and education and then enabling people to change their behaviour. And we've also planted 12,000 trees with our community as well. We have lots of initiatives for young people, such as our ambassador programme that helps young people to find other like-minded campaigners across the world and share stories and resources.
Brilliant, brilliant. And what makes you so passionate about protecting the environment?
So from a very young age, I've always been fascinated by our oceans and by marine life, and I've always wanted to be a marine biologist. Here I am now in my second year studying marine biology at Exeter. But when I was about 12, I read this book called The Ocean of Life by Callum, who is now actually a professor at Exeter.
Yeah.
And it was all about the threats that our oceans are facing, from microplastic pollution to ocean acidification and overfishing. And it made me really frightened that what I wanted to study would no longer be here when I grew up to do so. So I realized that I could use my voice to make a difference. And I started campaigning. I started writing to my MP, asking them to put a tax on plastic bags, and phoning Sainsbury's, asking them to stop stocking unsustainable tuna. And that grew into a passion really for using my voice to make change. And I realized that I could also change my behavior to live more sustainably. So I challenged my family to go plastic free when I was 15. And that led us on a journey towards sustainable living, and inspiring others to do the same.
Amazing. Now, obviously, it's COP26 at the moment. So what do you want to see achieved at the conference?
Well, scientists say that we need to reduce carbon emissions by 45% by 2030 on pre-industrial levels. And current world targets around the world mean that we'll actually see an increase of 16% by 2030. So I think that's really terrifying, and I think that COP26 is our very last chance really to make significant ambitious targets, but also not just words anymore. We need an action plan, and that needs to be holistic. I think that so often we concentrate on technological solutions, but carbon capture, for example, isn't going to solve the nature crisis, isn't going to bring back healthy soils. So I think that we need a holistic plan, and the government has a chance to set an example of how we can find solutions that create a healthier, happier planet for people and nature, from farming and agriculture to insulating buildings, providing infrastructure such as electric cars and better public transport, to making it easier for us as consumers to choose the healthier, more sustainable options when we go to the supermarket, for example.
Brilliant. And why do you think COP26 is such an important event?
I think that it is humanity's last chance, and I think that it's our government's chance to challenge governments around the world to make ambitious targets that the UK has, but also to set a plan to deliver on those, because currently we don't know how we're going to reach those targets, and I think that's really quite scary. But I also think that it's an opportunity for us to showcase what individuals can do and the power that individuals can and have made over the last few years.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Now, final question for you. What inspires you for the future?
I'm inspired every day by the people who choose to live a plant-based diet, or who choose not to fly abroad on holiday, the people who buy secondhand clothes, or who go plastic free. And I've met so many people on my journey who have made pledges like that. And it's people like them who give me hope for our future, and people like them who are going to save planet Earth. There are so many unsung heroes out there who have been fighting for our planet for decades. So it's those people that give me hope for our future. And I do see hope, but I think that the time to act is now.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Amy. It's really lovely to talk to you and really inspiring. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm joined by Callum Roberts, Professor of Marine Conservation at the University of Exeter. Much of Callum's research focuses on threats to marine ecosystems and species, and on finding means to protect them. In 2010, his research group helped establish 500,000 square kilometres of marine protection in the North Atlantic. As we've heard from Amy, Callum is also an author who has published 4 books on the oceans. Hi, Callum.
Hello.
So first of all, can you tell us a bit more about your research?
Yeah, so I've been looking at the long history of human influence on the oceans, and it turns out that we've been affecting the oceans in various ways for well over 1,000 years. We have a long legacy of hunting and fishing in the sea, which has led to some of the situation in the ocean that we see today. For example, industrial whaling 2 to 3 centuries ago has led to a reduction in the ocean's capacity to absorb carbon from the atmosphere. These sorts of issues need to be addressed today through conservation action. And my other strand of research is really figuring out how best to go about protecting species and places, and how do we make marine protected areas work for nature and for people too.
And how can marine ecosystems help us to reduce carbon in the atmosphere?
Well, the ocean has absorbed something like 30% of all anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions since the onset of the Industrial Revolution. And they do that through the process of dissolving of carbon dioxide into the sea, but then the taking up of that carbon dioxide in planktonic plants and also in coastal wetland ecosystems in particular. Fish absorb a large amount of carbon too. And as I've just mentioned, whales are an important mechanism for drawing carbon down from the atmosphere, because some whales, they dive deep, they feed on food deep down, they bring the nutrients back up to the surface where they fertilize plankton growth, and that plankton is then captured in the deep ocean as carbon deposits. So the ocean, with a healthy, vibrant, living ecosystem, is a very good sink for our carbon emissions.
Okay, and obviously all thoughts now are turning to COP26, which is just ahead. What do you want to see achieved at COP26?
I'd like to see the nations of the world come together to agree to implement effectively the Paris Agreement, which would limit our temperature rise on Earth to 1.5 degrees centigrade, which is the only sort of safe level of rise that we can foresee. To do that, they have to urgently withdraw support for fossil fuel mining and generating industries that are at the moment supported by ridiculous levels of government subsidies, which contrasts strongly with the amount of subsidy which is being given to renewable energies, which is what we need to transition to. So I think there's been a great deal of rhetoric which is not being matched by action. And Glasgow is really the last chance saloon for converting promises into action.
I suppose you've covered that in your answer, but my next question was going to be, why is COP26 so important?
COP26 is vital for the world to get back on track to meet the terms of the Paris Agreement, because we have so far lagged well behind the actions necessary to keep warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. If you look at countries' nationally declared contributions to meeting the Paris Agreement targets, they're not nearly sufficient to limit greenhouse gas warming to 1.5. In fact, we will see several degrees of rise by the end of the 21st century on the current trajectory. That just simply isn't good enough, and we're on a dangerous trajectory here.
And what gives you hope? What gives you optimism for the future?
Well, I think everybody knows about climate change now. Everyone knows that it's a threat to society and to nature and the environment. And so there is a lot more action taking place today than there was 20 years ago. At that point, the science was still being debated, but now the science is not in doubt anymore. What is in doubt is whether we will take the actions necessary. What gives me hope, though, is that future generations, or rather the present generations that will take over from the old guard of today who are sitting in Glasgow making the decisions, they are much more energized around creating a planet fit for human occupation a century from now. And I think we are training such people at the University of Exeter. I see their enthusiasm and idealism and energy, and I look forward to them going out into the world and making a difference.
Hi, I'm here with Katie Hodgetts, who is an Exeter alumna and founder of the Resilience Project, which is an initiative which seeks to build individual and collective resilience within the youth climate movement. Now, Katie's also campaigned with the UK Youth Climate Coalition since 2016 on issues from anti-fracking to COP to systems change, and also co-built the Bristol Youth Strike for Climate movement. So welcome, Katie. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. It's lovely to be back in touch with Exeter University.
Wonderful. Now, could you first just tell us a little bit more about the Resilience Project?
Yes, happily. So the Resilience Project was started by myself in 2020, and it was started as a critical intervention into the youth climate movement. And as you mentioned, I've been campaigning with UKYCC for about 5 years, and I'd worked with Bristol Youth Strike for Climate and been involved in many different youth spaces. And I saw very clearly that the movement was being hampered and actively damaged by eco-anxiety, by burnout, by poor mental health. I felt like there was no meaningful support systems in place, and adults at the time kept saying, take action. And that actually was perpetuating systems of burnout. So the Resilience Project, what it does is it hosts resilience circles, and that's where a maximum of 10 young people build a community of care over 8 weeks. And over the 8 weeks, we use the circles to empower young change makers, to build resilience and critically emotional awareness, as well as facilitating a space to connect with like-minded people and feel a sense of support and community. So this year, over summer, I trained 14 incredible young leaders, and they are now hosting resilience circles in their local movements in 6 cities in Scotland, Wales, and England, including with the youth leading on and holding up the youth efforts in Glasgow for COP26.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's really good to hear. Now, could you also just tell us a bit about what inspired you to get involved in climate action in the first place?
Yeah, so very specifically, what inspired me to get involved in climate action was when I took the Politics of Climate Change module at Exeter University during my studies. And it was then that I realized that beyond the imagery of the polar bear on the melting ice cap, there was so much more to climate change, and climate change had a human face. So whilst biodiversity loss and environmental degradation are huge facets of the climate crisis, I unearthed and uncovered and realized the politics of the climate crisis and how power was a really fundamental instrument. So what I realized is that there were a very small group of powerful people that were making a profit on my right to a just and fair future. So instead of getting angry, I got active. And that's when I joined the UKYCC, and the rest is history.
Brilliant. And what would you say to young people who are, they're worried about the climate crisis and they're looking to make a difference?
So this is a really interesting question. If you are a young person and you're watching this and you're worried about the climate crisis, first of all, I would actually say, great. Worrying shows that you care. So all of your worry, all of your emotions, your anger, your sadness, your despair, your hopelessness, your fear, the plethora of emotions that you hold are all incredibly legitimate responses to an emergency. So if you're feeling these emotions often, I would say that this is a sign that you care, and those emotions might not go away overnight just by taking action.
Yep.
So what we want to do is we want to build communities of support and build spaces where we feel really seen and heard. We build these communities, we sit in the emotions, and then we use that as compost for action. So that's the sequencing. And it's really, really important to lean into those worries and those emotions and then use it to transform it into hope and action. So if you're looking for communities, have a think about what local groups you have access to. So look at Fridays for Future, look at the Resilience Project, UKYCC, UK Youth for Nature, or start your own, start a society, join a society. There are lots of different options.
Brilliant, thank you. Now, thinking about COP itself, what is it that you'd really like to see achieved at this 26th COP?
Yes, so for COP26, I will be there. I will be a UK youth delegate. And what I want to see, for me, it's about political will.
Yep.
So it's not so much technological solutions or celebrity endorsements, but it's political will to enact existing solutions and necessary shifts. So we already have a lot of the answers. We already have a lot of the leading figures that just need to be amplified. So it's just about leaning into political will to engender those systemic shifts.
Wonderful. And one final question for you, Katie. What gives you hope for the future?
That is an easy answer. The youth movement, the UK youth movement and the international youth movement. I've had the absolute pleasure of working with hundreds of youth activists, and they are radical and uncompromising and creative and fun. And the youth movement has a real ability to infuse joy in all of its action. And I really do believe that joy is one of the few things that makes stepping up towards this massive climate crisis an experience that can be sustainable rather than something that will lead to burnout.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time, Katie. Really appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
This year, global leaders will be travelling to Glasgow to decide the actions needed to fight climate change. This decade is crucial for our world. We need to stand together, muster up the might, and have the courage to fight for our Earth and our communities. Not just for those who are already here, but for generations to come. We need action, we deserve action, and we are brave enough to get it.